Hand it over to the panelists now.
Uh, Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Amir, and I am a faculty at IHS. To my right is my esteemed colleague, dear friend Jairaj, who is also a faculty here. So he was not supposed to be a part of this panel, but I requested him in the interest of participants, because he has rich experience both working through grassroots level interventions and research, and also the top level policy kind of work. So I think we are privileged to have him. Uh, what we'll do is, unfortunately, we have only 3 presentations in this session. Two of the participants who were supposed to present couldn't make it. So I think we'll still finish by 4:15. So, but we'll also have a lot of time for discussion. What I think would work is that we'll ask the presenters to make a 15 to 20 minutes presentation or what they wanted to present, and then we can have a Q&A based on the presentation, which would be an immediate follow-up to the presentation of 5 to 7 minutes. And we can complete this round, and then we can have an open floor and have a more engaging dialogue around the challenges of looking at migration vis-a-vis urbanization. I think, would that be fine? Okay. So, without taking much time, what I'll do is that I'll make 3 or 4 points in the context of migration and urbanization, and also how do I see it. And then I will request Jairaj to give his brief thoughts on initial opening thoughts, and then we can start with the presentations. But before I make these interjunctions, I will request the presenters to give a brief introduction about themselves.
Hi, my name is Sridevi. I'm a student from Tata Institute, Mumbai.
Hello, I'm Soundarya. I'm currently doing my PhD at the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore, and my thesis is on the dynamics of rural transformation in Karnataka.
Thank you. Would you like to say something extra about yourself?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tanvi. I'm working with IHS, and I'm part of the climate change team here.
Okay, thank you very much, and welcome. My introduction, I am not trained to understand migration in a purist way. So my initial introduction to this issue came through chance. So I was teaching in a university in Pune, and I was asked to teach a course on the economics of international migration. And it was a forced kind of a setup, but then I started looking at this issue, but from a pure economics lens. So when I joined IHS almost 3.5 years back, then I delved into other issues, and then my knowledge of my study of migration in an earlier avatar was very useful, because the project I lead here has migration as a very important theme that we are investigating. So I don't claim myself to be a specialist, but in a general sense, I do understand that migration is a very important topic in the current context, and there's something that needs to be done and understood about it. So from my limited understanding, I would talk about 3 or 4 things which we should try and debate through and talk about collectively, and also using the presentations as an entry point. One is that having recognized that it's an important issue that needs attention, how can we investigate or interrogate this topic from the perspective of linking research, policy, and practice. So there's something that researchers do. There's a viewpoint from policy makers, and there's some practice-based engagements. The second is that what are its different dimensions? So to the papers, you unfortunately, 2 presentations are not there, but there are multiple dimensions. There's the experience of a migrant. There's a challenge of moving across rural and urban settlements. There's a challenge around quality of life. There are livelihood challenges. So there are different dimensions. And what are those dimensions which are important from a prospective point of view? Considering that we are still officially 32% urbanized, what will it mean when we are like 50-60% urbanized? The third point is that, and this is something which I day in and day out experience through the project which I am doing, is that perhaps older frames to look at this migration question are not enough to understand the current dynamics, be it economics or be it other disciplines. So what kind of methodological innovations or sort of reorientation of frames might be required to understand this issue in a holistic way? And I think some light will be thrown by the presenters, but there are many important, I know many people in the room who have been engaging with this issue in different ways. Shravan is here. He must have engaged this issue in a different perspective. So once we finish with the presentation, so I'll urge all of you to contribute to this dialogue, and maybe that will enrich our understanding about this issue. Thank you. Jairaj?
How much time do we have?
5 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks, Amir. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for that, inviting me here. I'm not a scholar on migration. However, migration occurs on my work, and all kinds of things that we do on cities related research in many ways. Just let me think through one or two few things. Why study migration? There is a whole. If we think about why study migration, or there is the preoccupation of it is settlement, right? That there is the idea that there is a permanent settlement, and hence migration is something to be understood. And it always is connected in that sense, whether it is the politics of it, whether it is the economics of it, whether it is the utilitarian things about living about it, like housing and services or whatever. So, from that perspective, I think there were 2 ways to, usually people work with pull and push. But, to think about it, one is external factors, one is internal factors. Now, reason for studying migration could vary differently based on where you study them, at what point in history you study them, right? External factors quite important. That, for instance, you take states in India, there are big cities, and for a very long time we've been dealing with big cities, and we had a policy of integrated development, small and medium towns, to say that the whole urbanization geography of India is so much big city oriented. So we have to emphasize infrastructure, jobs and provisions and all on smaller cities, and so there was a whole policy on that. Now, even if you take after that in the states, we do have very big cities. Take Tamil Nadu, first big city is Chennai, second is Coimbatore, I don't know, 1/10 of the size or 1/5 of the size, and then Madurai is much smaller. Third bigger cities. I'm just giving an example. So the conceptual foundations of migration have a notion of settlement and notion of boundary. A bounded geography belonging, bounded geography governance, bounded geography economic transactions. These are the basis on which migration becomes a problem for study, and in that context, urbanization, this is the hugely important conversation to think about. That is, how do we want the urbanization in the country about, in geography of South about, in the world about, it's a very, very important question. right? To think about, in the sense that to say that we think about big cities, in the sense people coming in and hence study migration from inside or from outside. You know, studying migration from outside is what I'm trying to reflect on, the notion of thinking about urbanization broadly as a policy thinking. The second, internal, okay? Internal questions are very, very interesting in the sense to think, you know, like there are divisions between social classes, ethnic groups, and so on, which migration creates. There is a question to really ask that in the social transactions of economy, of all kinds of things, right? Who contributes more? I mean, in a sense, everybody contributes equally, right? To think of, okay, then the rich and the poor. So the people who are coming in, so the rich migrates hugely to, you know, places like Bangalore, places like where, you know, London, places like Mumbai, and so on. And then there is a whole poor people migrating to support the service economy of it, informal. But the way that is seen as two different things, and that's a hugely important question to ask. In the sense, to studying migration should probably lead us to ask whose contribution is important, and can we think about it as an equal contribution? And in the sense, it has implications on how do we provide services, housing, and so on. There is a whole question on the politics of belonging that again is a boundary-based question. We know that politics of belonging has been used time and again in different times in history against migrants, using migrants, and so on to make geographies of exclusion, right? Some recent examples from around the world includes Brexit, includes the US campaign. They're all nationalist campaigns about bounded geographies. It was not so long ago the similar campaigns happened in Mumbai, as you would remember the Shiv Sena campaign and so on. So the sense to say that who's the outsider, who's the insider becomes a hugely important political problem. And so the politics of migration studies is, in that sense, is very, very, very significant. And then, of course, as Amir said, climate refugees, climate change related migration, it's an extremely complex phenomenon to even to identify the causality as much as understand whether it is specifically climate change impact related or not. But then there is this whole other world that we have been seeing now, war and refugees. Some of the early settlements post-independent India is resultant of partition, which is Faridabad. Wars and conflict is increasing at an alarming rate, and migration studies very significantly can tell us not just about internal, but also where they come from. It's a larger conversation that migration studies can tell us about. Then there is also the question about brain drain and remittances. The capital flows are eased and freed up, but labor flows are not. I mean, it's a very important question to ask. The more and more as we get into 21st century, we see capital flows are being eased up. Capital, we want it to be circulating, but labor isn't. And it's a very important question to ask, why does that happen? And does this because geographies are bounded and belonged? I mean, great examples all around us. And then the remittances, and it's all connected story. Whether to think about a geography of development is through remittances, or whether to think about geography of development is through contributing to social development and letting the people go, or is there at all an issue? What are the conceptual foundations on which we build migration studies becomes a hugely important thing, according to me. And then the question of where do we study it from, immigration or emigration, right? Then there are other whole very interesting way of thinking about the psychology of the migrants themselves, in the sense of the belonging, the social capital use of it, and the way they build social networks once settled down, or the psychology of where do they belong. Most people in the world are migrants and they belong everywhere or in two places and so on. So that's urbanization related migration, and the recent statistics show that rural migration in India, for instance, is much bigger in number than rural urban migration. So then there is one more question I would reflect here, that is on, the scholarship is very strange. It kind of makes its own disciplinary or traditional methods. So gentrification studies is another interesting one. In geography, human geography is very hugely on gentrification studies. It's people moving in the city, people moving into the city, or city as a bounded category. And I would reflect, why can't gentrification study be part of migration studies? In gentrification, basically, as you all know, that people moving in, displacing richer people moving in, displacing poorer people and their capacities and so on. So migration studies foundational geographial base is a very important thing. Notion of belonging, very important thing. Where do we study it from, very important thing. And historically it has been there. We all migrated from wherever, right? So at what point in history do we study them, and why do we, that point in history do we study them, becomes a very important thing.
Acha, you have that.
Good afternoon, everyone. My topic for presentation is exploring the changing domestic migration patterns in Kerala. To set the location, Kerala is a southern state of India, and the state is known for a high human development index in terms of higher literacy rate and higher life expectancy. So this higher literacy rate has produced a lot of unemployed, educated unemployed in the state, and people move to Middle East and other foreign countries in search of jobs. And these educated, the literates in Kerala, they were not able to fill up certain employment in certain sectors like informal employment. So this has attracted migrants from other states. So initially it was Tamil Nadu and Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh, the southern states the people from southern states which moved to Kerala, but now the increase in construction and other informal employment have attracted people from other northern states as well. So just an introduction, the terms that is used in the paper are labor migration, which is known as cross-border movement for purposes of employment, used restrictively to cover movement for employment. And classification of labor migration is done on the duration of stay. There is temporary and permanent labor purpose, and these form part of an economic activity. And the domestic migration, which is also used as internal migration, it's movement of people within the national boundaries. And internal migration is temporary and circular in nature. Circular migration it helps people to keep one foot in their village and access employment in other areas. So this kind of migration is seen more among the domestic migrants because they have their family in their own village, and once they go back to their village, they bring their relatives and friends to the state so that they get employment. And the characteristics of domestic migrant laborers, they are poor and they come from backward communities. Studies have shown that migrants predominantly are from the lower social strata of SC, ST, OBC, and majority of them are illiterate, they are landless, and they are marginal farmers. And this is related to low educational status and poorer asset base of the social groups. And internal migrants are employed in risky and insecure occupations in the informal sector. In such cases, the internal migrants lack formal contracts and access to any sort of social protection. It has been noted that the numbers of domestic migrant laborers in Kerala is over 2 million. And urbanization is one of the key pull factors of migration. High rates of temporary and permanent migration have taken place to urbanized areas despite unemployment and rising urban poverty. With respect to Kerala, urbanization and informalization has been taking place rapidly, and these have attracted large number of migrant laborers. With respect to Kerala, the main centers that you can call as urban are the cities like Kochi, Trivandrum, and Kozhikode and the Malabar region. And the methodology, mainly the data is used from secondary sources, and the theoretical analysis has been done based on the neoclassical theory of labor migration in economics. And the Todaro model, it talks about the decision to migrate is functionally related to rural-urban real income differentials and the probability of obtaining an urban job. The studies that have been conducted adds to this, uses this model because the main reason behind the migration is the attraction of the income that they get in Kerala. As per the economics of labor migration, migration of labor is due to the differences in the real wages between the origin and destination. The neoclassical theory of migration explains the decision to migrate as purely an individual one, which was formed as a response to market forces in the labor market. This theory ignored the fact that the migrants belonged to social groups such as households and communities. This theory was optimistic about the positive relation between migration and economic development. And if you look at the status of migrants in Kerala, initially it was from the states of Tamil Nadu, Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh. They were seeking employment in unskilled jobs at construction, road workers, for ironing clothes, etc. And recently, people from Bihar, Bengal, UP and Assam, they constitute a major portion of the domestic migrant laborers who come to Kerala. The state experiences high levels of immigration to foreign countries such as the Middle East. This immigration has generated both wealth and job opportunities at home. As a result of these changes, the state is able to attract interstate migrants and provide employment with relatively better payments compared to their home state. This is taken from a study conducted by the Gulati Institute, and this diagram shows the flow of people from states like Assam, West Bengal, Odisha, Andhra Pradesh to Kerala. And the studies shows that 235,000 estimated number of migrants arrive in Kerala. 75% of these migrants are from West Bengal, Bihar, Assam, UP, Odisha. And 17.28% of workers are from Assam. It is estimated that over 25 lakh domestic migrant laborers arrive in Kerala with an annual rate of 2.35 lakhs. They send home about 17,500 crores. Majority of the workforce consists of male population aged between 18 to 35. Their average working hours is 10. And with respect to urbanization in Kerala, it's based on the population that is from the 1901 to 2011 census. We can see an increase in the urban population from 7.11% to 47%, almost half of Kerala. And with respect to Kerala, the difference between village and rural and urban is not as wide as like what you see in Orissa and other northern states. Only if you look at the population, you cannot classify the villages in Kerala as villages because with respect to population, they have a high population rate in villages. But if you look at the other amenities that are seen only in cities, then the classification of urban and rural happens in Kerala. And Kerala has the highest density of population in the country and has very little vacant land. The 1,384 villages in Kerala are occupied. There are no uninhabited villages in Kerala. If only population is taken as the criteria for considering a locality as urban, then 98% of villages in Kerala can be considered as an urban area. The rural-urban divide is lesser in Kerala, and therefore the migrants are spread to the villages also. But the study conducted by CDS shows that even then there is a concentration of migrant laborers in major cities like Trivandrum, Ernakulam, Thrissur and Kozhikode. And we can see the majority of the people are employed as construction and road repairs, and they are self-employed as sandwich shops and other things that you can see on the roadside. And they also stand as helpers in restaurants and domestic servants. And with respect to the work and wages of migrants, what attracts people to Kerala is an important, and one of the newspapers, the Mint newspaper, reported Kerala as it's a gulf for domestic migrant laborers. In the year 2015, Kerala has paid the highest wage both to men and women laborers in almost all daily wage jobs in the agricultural and non-agricultural sectors. The state provides an average of rupees 582 in agricultural sector and rupees 620 for non-agricultural sector, whereas the country's average is 230 rupees and 242 for non-agricultural. And this is with respect to a study conducted by the Gulati Institute, Venkateshwaran Narayanan, 2013. The wages per day, majority 36%, they get a wage more than 400. And those who get above 500 are 11%. So from the study, discussed, and it is suggested that the large supply of interstate migrants has made the supply of labor cheap, therefore informalized the labor in the manufacturing and industrial sectors of production. This has brought down the cost of production and the social security benefits are not taken care of. Getting an unskilled job in a city has many issues that go along with the lifestyle in an urban locality. The problem of overcrowding and lack of enough space for accommodation are common issues faced by migrant workers. Migration from rural to urban areas is also seen as a livelihood strategy as it helps to manage risk and diversify income. Thus, poverty reduction and finding alternative livelihood opportunities become another motive behind migration decision. The displacement of laborers from the rural to urban economy has created job opportunities, and it has also generated wide range of employment opportunities in the informal sector. The security of job and ensuring a minimum wage for these laborers are also vital to prevent the exploitation of the workers. In Kerala, the labor union, the state is known for a higher labor unions and the impact it has on ensuring minimum wage, etc. But there is still a friction between the domestic workers who come into the state and the workers who are already in the union. So the major policy suggestion would be to incorporate the domestic workers also into the union and also consider their minimum wages right and other social security benefits. It is important, so I would like to conclude, like it is important to view migration as a positive phenomenon that enhances the socio-economic condition of the people. The laborers who migrate to cities for employment in the informal sector also need to be made aware of their labor rights. The workers are exploited by providing less than a minimum wage and providing unhealthy and unhygienic places for the workers to stay. All these issues need to be addressed by the government and authorities to ensure a secure work environment. The cities have now become the centers of development in terms of opportunities for employment in the informal sector. Migrating to cities has turned out to be a great challenge for the development discourse. Exchange of opportunities and culture has resulted in a wider developmental perspective. Urban poverty, growth of slums, and social deprivation are major challenges faced by the developing economies. So the Kerala Planning Board and the government need to take measures to ensure that the workers do not stay, they get a hygienic place to stay, and they get a healthy and other social security benefits which is offered to other laborers who are employed in the state. Yeah, thank you.
Questions?
Yeah, I can ask one. I think it will be really interesting to see the understanding the migration or immigrants in Kerala and the conversation around it in the context of the history of the remittances and capital coming in. There was a time when there wasn't any, you could see into smaller towns and you see these shopping complexes where there is no one to buy anything and no one to sell anything. And then there are this whole consumption group now coming in, 235,000 people or something, right? Like you're saying, and it might increase. What is the percentage of increase of it is an interesting question. But then to see that is the capital being deployed for productive things, and is the wage that they earn are spending there or sending back, how much of it spent there and sending back, in the sense to see, are migrants going to be settlers? I mean, what is the question that we are thinking about it rather than a mere description of statistics about it?
Yeah, thank you. It was quite interesting to hear that because of the influx of migrants, then sort of, did you say that the wages come down? The wages goes up, but you said that the cost of production comes down. I found to be a bit contradictory. But nonetheless, I think it's an important issue because what is happening is that we all know from economics knowledge that wages are quite sticky. People are not ready to accept lower wages than they already are. But what happens is that migrants are more vulnerable, so they come and accept lower wages. And this creates conflict now between them and natives. And that's sort of an important thing to think about and look at. This actually has a major has been major cause of the xenophobic problems you've had in some parts of the world in the last few years, as late as last year.
Suggestion for you. So Kerala is the only state which has an Interstate Migrant Workers Act. So whether it's implemented or not, there are requirements that every migrant worker who comes to the state has to register, has to have a daycare facility for the kids, and also some medical expenses are taken care of. So it'll be good to look at how it is implemented and what sort of measures are being taken and all.
Thank you for that lecture. I think it was quite revealing to me. I mean, I wasn't aware that, Kerala is attracting quite those many numbers, and that illustration of that trail from Assam all the way down to Kerala, particularly that railway connection or whatever, is probably a major thing. And I do understand probably the scope of your study was more statistical, perhaps. But it does throw up a lot of very interesting questions in terms of the sustainability of, and whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, whether it should be encouraged, it shouldn't be encouraged. Do we just look at the destination and how to, improve their life at the destination and not look at the source, what is driving these people to leave their homes, and most of them are men. What Keralites are going through in the Middle East is probably very akin to what these people are going through, the male population of these migrants are going through in Kerala itself. There's a certain displacement, I'm sure alienation that also happens. Also moving forward, the sustainability of this whole model, this sort of globalization of people or services, if you will, where, where there's demand, people just move there. Or whether we look at localization, which is, a glocal, which I think is catching on. I think is very, very important right now, where we just don't blindly celebrate globalization and this migration and the upward movement of wages as a result. But good lecture. Thank you for that.
I think this seems to be preliminary work in some way. So that's what which we have not got into the details of that. But one thing which will be very interesting, to understand in the context of this migration is Kerala is a state which also a lot of people go out from Kerala. They are also migrants in a way, within India, outside India. But then you also have a group of migrants coming into Kerala. So I think this is a very interesting issue to conceptualize and theorize. How do you see this migration issue from the perspective of people, those who are going from that state to other places, their issues of identity, rights, and how do they view that? And also, when people into that state come from other places, what is the discourse about? I think this is one critical aspect which Kerala poses a very unique question for us to conceptualize the issue of migration. I think maybe that will be a very interesting way. The other thing I thought was, you see, in terms of the areas that you said about urban and rural, and you very rightly said that actually there are a large number of migrants also in so-called, they are already urban, but they are in the rural areas. I think it will be very interesting also to explore how do the migrants create their spaces in urban area. Like you talked about housing. I think one of the ways I think both the speakers were talking about is, do we need to see migration issue from a new perspective? So only we are talking about, okay, migrants have housing problem. But the problem is, because of the housing problem, they also create their own neighborhoods, so what is it like about in the cities? What are their entitlements? Does it create any conflict with respect to land, tenure? This type of issues is very interesting to explore in Kerala, also because it is one of the most densest population cities in. I think that will be a nice way to explore.
I have one quick question. Also, what's the relation between unions and the migrants? Unions, workers' union, and the immigrants.
You'd like to respond? I think many of these inputs were in the nature of suggestions, which you could consider when you fully flesh this out. But maybe if you would like to respond.
Thank you for the suggestions and thank you. And with respect to the crisis that the state is facing, there is a friction between the union and the migrant workers, and the act was not able to implement all of it, I would say. And with respect to the people, living in a crowded place, and if you go for field work, you can see people living in a very crowded, very much cramped and unhygienic. They use the same, and there's no proper sanitation facility. And the only criteria that you look at is wages. And as of now, they send home, they save a lot, and they mainly work under a one person who will be giving jobs to a particular 50 or 40 of them. So with that, they save a lot for staying, and they reduce their consumption, and they concentrate more on sending home. And in that way, they also bring their friends and relatives next time when they come back. And in the society, we can see the increasing crime rates, and all this is related to the migrant people who are in the cities. And with respect to the recent, the rape, the Jisha case is maybe probably the known one in Kerala. So that's also related. They say the person is a migrant laborer. So in that way, the increasing crime rates and other tension in the society is also have a great impact on those people. And the way in which the local people view them is also different. And also in a positive way, the local Malayalis have started using terms like bhai, bhaiya and all in their local conversation, so that they've also started incorporating Hindi words. And because in Kerala, Hindi is not a much accepted word and much accepted language. So in that way, there's a positive as well as a negative impact that have been seen in that scene visibly. Yeah, thanks.
Jairaj has something to add to this. He is from that state.
I mean, Malayalam can't be used without Portuguese words, Spanish words. So in other words, to say that the whole damn place is a continuous migration history, has a deep migration history, which is, I mean, there is no Kerala breakfast without Jewish food. There is no, it's just so deeply connected. So the question to think about is, at what point in time did others and us got separated to become not to be part of union rights, not to be part of housing rights, the labor camps in Perimbaur and so on and so forth, right? At what point in time, how did we make the other in the process, while we ourselves are a history of complete migration, right from the language to food to housing typology to whatnot? I think it's
Gaining, who's losing, at the cost of what. So thank you very much, and I think these all inputs will be very useful for your further study. Let me now invite Tanvi to make a presentation. She will be accompanied by one of her colleagues, Karthik. And they have decided who's going to present what.
Good afternoon, everyone. As I mentioned previously, I'm working at IHS. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to try and demystify how effective is migration as a coping strategy. We've been able to do this as part of the project called ASAR, which stands for Adaptation at Scale in Semi-Arid Regions. It's part of a larger project called CARIA, and we have multiple partners in Africa. And within India, we're looking at research sites in Maharashtra, Karnataka, and Tamil Nadu. So let me set context to the pre-migration story. What has led to migration within cities like Bangalore? So the causal factors are either climatic, non-climatic, or a mix of both. Who is it that is migrating? It's as Sridevi has set context, and she's done a great job with the theory of migration, so thank you, Sridevi. So in terms of who is migrating, it's the landless, it's the poor farmers who have no income or are belonging to a certain class, religion, caste. And the case that we are talking about is informal settlements within Bangalore. We focused on informal settlements, assuming that they're underrepresented, they're not properly represented, because some of the settlements that we have looked at are non-notified or undeclared settlements, informal settlements, so there's absolutely no record of them. And we had a tough time locating those settlements and actually going on field and trying to understand what's happening. So my colleague Karthik will run you through the methods.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. So as Tanvi mentioned that our focus was on informal settlements because we feel that a lot of migrants coming into the city are going into these informal settlements looking for work in the informal sector, and these people aren't represented at all. So the criteria what we chose to look at to pick out these various informal settlements across the city is their geography, their infrastructure, and the demography. So what exactly we did was we divided the city into 4 major clusters, like the Northern Airport Road cluster, the one which is near the industrial area, the one cluster near Mysore Road, and the other IT cluster, which is where the most recent development is happening in Bangalore. So we chose these clusters, we identified a few settlements in each of these clusters, like around 8 in each cluster, so we had a total of 35 settlements. And so in these settlements what we did was we employed this mixed method approach for doing our field research. Our mixed method approach included both quantitative and qualitative fieldwork. Our quantitative fieldwork was mainly a household survey. It was an in-depth household survey. We rolled it on across like 1,200 households in these 35 settlements, and we gathered very nuanced data from the basic data as such. Like we gathered simple basic points like their caste, their location of the origin of migration, to more nuanced data like what sort of fuel they use for cooking, or what's the primary source of electricity, or what is their sanitation, what sort of medical facilities do they have, do they have any transport facilities available. So we got a lot of in-depth survey-based information from the quantitative study. We also picked up their subjective well-being, like how happy they are living there. So with the quantitative data, we could come up with broad trends, and then we tried to substantiate these trends using our qualitative fieldwork, which is focus group discussion, semi-structured interviews, and key informant interviews, like in these settlements. While doing focus group discussions, like we were aiming for like a participatory model. We were also looking for a community perspective so that we can get a comprehensive picture of these settlements. So these are a couple of sites where we visited. These are undeclared settlements. So this is one of the quote which a respondent actually told in the interview. Like he said that there is a sky-high difference, and they're living right next to these up-and-coming posh neighborhoods, and they provide essential services there as well. So this is us in the fieldwork. We used a participatory method where we had charts of the local map of the settlement, and we tried identifying what their water sources are, which part of the settlement is flooded, and we're also trying to map things like who provides them with basic services, like is it government, is it a private actor, or is it some individual who's providing. So what broad findings we had from the fieldwork is that the migrants who are coming into the city, if they are interstate migrants, they have a serious issue with the language. They can't connect to the local government authorities well, which also affects them, like they're unable to form local collectives here. And because of the lack of collectives, they are unable to push for access to basic services from the government as such. And also a broad trend we found was the older the settlements are, it was filled with non-migrants or locals. It was also filled with intrastate migrants, like coming from Bijapur, Gulbarga, Raichur places. And it takes around 30 to 40 years for a settlement to get notified by the government. And once it's notified, it gets better services like household water supply, household electricity. And the newer settlements which have come up in the last 4 or 5 years have no access to any form of basic services. So with the data we got, what we did was we constructed 2 indices. One was livelihood vulnerability index and basic structure and infrastructure index. So for livelihood vulnerability index, we mapped out we used the 5 capital approach, where we picked on the human capital, the social capital, the financial capital, the physical capital, and the natural capital. And using that, when we plotted the index, and when we plotted against the subjective well-being, we could clearly see that the more vulnerable they get, the less happier they are. So this was for us to verify that our indices were actually working. So once we established that the indices make sense, we tried comparing different sections of the sample set to see what sort of results come out. So this is from our urban data set. We can clearly see that the interstate migrants are more vulnerable, both in terms of livelihood and basic services. We can also see that migrants are more vulnerable than non-migrants. We can see that people living in undeclared settlements are more vulnerable. And if we do a cross-sectional analysis of, suppose we take how if a migrant is living in a undeclared settlement, and he tends to be the most vulnerable. Like you can see a migrant in an undeclared settlement has a vulnerability of 0.72, which is much higher than suppose a non-migrant in a declared settlement. One more cross-section, if you take the basic services as well, the migrant in an undeclared settlement are the most vulnerable, right? I guess for more of the findings, I'll pass it over to Tanvi.
Thank you, Karthik. So based on the qualitative findings, what emerged from our studies were that the migration that has happened within Bangalore and within the informal settlements, the groups that we have studied, there's a push and a pull factor, where the push factor plays a predominant role. Push factor meaning the climatic, the non-climatic factors. The pull factor is obviously livelihood opportunities within the city. And the livelihoods that these migrants choose are either waste picking, construction, domestic help. And I would like to point out that domestic help is also predominantly a livelihood that is chosen by the women. So the women who in fact did not work in the native places, especially in the case of interstate migrants from West Bengal, the women who were not allowed to work in their villages have actually come to the city feeling much more empowered because they're allowed to go work, they're getting additional income. So in a way, yes, there are pros to migrating. And in terms of social networks, especially with the case of interstate migrants, you're coming to a totally different land. It's a foreign land, you don't speak the language, but there is this social network, there's this one person, either it's your relative or it's somebody from your village who's helping you come to a different city, find a place within the city to live in, to find some sort of opportunity, to work, to earn. Again, gender and so following on what Sridevi was saying, that when you move from your native places, you tend to, there's some sort of social stratification that you face there. It's in terms of religion, there's caste, there's gender, there's gender, and there's class as well. But when you come to the city, do you actually think that these stratifications matter, or do they interplay? How effective are they? I mean, how strong do they play in these communities? So we actually constructed a framework which helped, based on our findings, which helped us to understand that vulnerability, you need to understand vulnerability through multiple lenses. It's a matter of scale. You look at the national issues, you look at the regional development or the issues of the state, and how all of them are influencing the migration within the city. Also, there is an entire story of landscape. There's the rural to urban migration. So you cannot just look at urbanization or cities just on their own. You need to look at the rural-urban continuum. So what this framework does is that it looks at how issues of unequal growth or discriminatory policies where agriculture does not get adequate attention, or even the lack of effective adaptation policies. So India has the National Action Plan on Climate Change. There are just maybe 2 or 3 action plans that look at adaptation. The rest are focused on mitigation. Again, the focus is on rural areas. There is very little that is given to urban spaces. All of this actually interplays at the regional level as well, where there is some sort of stratification, again, as I said, because of your income, your class, your religion, gender. The land holdings become unviable because there's not enough subsidies or policies that are supporting you. If I'm a landless laborer, or if I'm a small landholder, I find it really hard to support myself and to actually manage to protect my land. Drought and flooding are also a major factor, a factor that plays into them losing their income, because increasingly migrants from Raichur, Gulbarga, Bijapur, all are saying that they have moved because there is a lot of drought, there's no water. So there is a form of distress migration. The migrants from West Bengal have actually moved because there was actually a mass movement of migration because there was a cyclone or a flood called Sidha, so which moved majority of them from districts of Nadia and Murshidabad because they were severely affected. So what we are trying to say is that it's a choice that these people have made. It's a choice between 2 injuries. What would I choose? Would I choose to be living in my native place where I have no income, or would I choose to be in a place, in a city where I am not recognized, I have no rights, I'm living in an unsafe, unviable place where I have no tenureship, I have no protection, and the work I am doing, the city does not acknowledge the work I am doing. So this is something that has come up, saying that vulnerability keeps repeating. It's the place that changes. So I would like to throw up questions to the audience, saying that how do we go about understanding issues of rights and recognitions? And again, is migration, I mean, we need to understand that there is a class, or there's a caste, or there's an income level that we need to look at. Because if I am a migrant, the way I experience migration, or the way I experience a city is very different from somebody coming from a different class. Yeah, I guess that's about it. I hope I've done my bit, yeah. Thank you.
Questions? Garaj?
I think it's an interesting study, but I have some, has this study been completed? It's ongoing, so maybe I'll make some suggestion. One thing about this vulnerability and adaptive capacity, you selected the slums based on some criteria, right? I think one of the criteria which you missed out is the duration, the history of the settlement, how long they have been there. Because the adaptive capacity depends upon the duration of the stay in the city, because the vulnerability and adaptive capacity is also a function of how they negotiate the city through linkages, maybe political, whatever. So migration is, the story about, everybody tells the migrants are most vulnerable. But some studies have also found, if you compare urban poor, the migrants have higher income, higher earnings than the non-migrants. Why is it that? That is also because there are certain characteristics of the migrant which makes them much more, in terms of coping and also working and all that. So that dimension is, I think, little bit missing. So I would suggest what you can do is, because you have also done, these case studies, the survey must be over. What you need to do is, can you identify some migrants who have been successful despite all these odds? And how did they do it? I think that is a more interesting story than saying that, because everybody knows migrants are vulnerable. That is what has been the, stories people have told, that migrants are vulnerable, there are conflicts, they go to Bombay, they get beaten up, whatever. But my story is, how do they survive? And how do they succeed? I think that dimension, if you capture, if the study is still there, that will address your issue of, I'm telling this basically because you're talking about barriers and enablers. Maybe you only talked about barriers. I didn't see any story about the enablers. I think that is what we need to do.
My question is about the levels and the stages of recognition of the settlements. So there are settlements who get recognized in few aspects and with respect to few utilities, but not in the official government records. So like I have one example from Bombay where there is one illegal slum which has been provided with these water facilities, medical and electricity, but still in the larger development plan for Bombay, it is not recognized as an area. It is recognized as a mangrove area. So adjacent area adjacent to mangrove. So and sometimes it happens that even when the recognition happens in the government records, these utilities don't reach in the settlements. So what were your observations in your kind of study?
I have a question. Can I? Yeah, so my question is about the perception of identity among the people that you interviewed and surveyed. So you said you looked at older settlements, 30, 40 years old, and also newer settlements. So did the people in the older settlements recognize themselves as migrants, or were they more like, what did they think of themselves as compared to people who've just come in, and what were the aspirations of the people who just moved in? Did they still recognize themselves as people who've moved from another place, or do they recognize themselves as citizens of the city?
Yeah, mine is just a curiosity. So when you were showing some of these, outcomes from your research, one of the things that you said was that, migrants were more likely to be vulnerable than non-migrants, and it reminded me of this paper by Kundu and others, and then what they found was completely the contrary, because they according to their study, it was that non-migrants in the urban are more likely to be poor than migrants. And I think the idea they were playing on was the idea of choice and the ability to move, and ability, and of course the capability frame. If we link that with the whole adaptive capacity frame, how do you in this, I mean, I'm not sure whether the methods were different and how you identified your non-migrant pool in these various settlements that you studied. How are these sort of connected in your research in some ways?
My question or curiosity is related to what she just asked, because maybe it will be helpful to look into policies as well, because when you're talking about migrants and you're talking about migrants who are settled like 20 or 30 years, they sometimes have they have the rights to EWS housing. But then if you are new migrants, maybe there are some policies, like for example in Gurgaon, the EWS housing which is coming up right now. So the state migrants are only capable of kind of registering themselves for these kind of housing, whereas the interstate migrants are not. So maybe if there are some policies which kind of look into some sector of particular and how vulnerable they are,
could be helpful.
Just one more thing. So our experience in my experience in Delhi showed that adding to her policy, there were a lot of policies which were responsible for the vulnerability. Like for example, the Land Acquisition Act. So they could be like displaced easily whenever any construction is happening. So they are just moved so easily. And also a huge political aspect, like these people used as the vote bank sometimes, and for all the manipulations. So these also play a very important role of probably how they are distributed all around the city. And I don't think interventions and the rights and ownerships is possible. Interventions in these aspects are possible unless we understand what is the government's attitude towards these people. So do they really want to give them rights, or is it something else? I mean, a lot of times it shows they keep delaying it and they don't give them the rights thing. So what are the reasons for that? So that probably can complete the picture of the understanding of how migrants work in the city. And also land ownership. So what kind of lands do they really occupy in the city? So generally it's the unproductive lands of the city that they organize. They settle around the nalas and stuff. So how are they initially distributed when they come? So probably these aspects would help you complete the picture. Yeah.
I would definitely like to respond on the question related to enablers and how effective and the adaptive capacity. So, sorry, can you hear me? Okay. So when we're looking at them as migrants, you're trying to see how, okay, they're trying to look at a positive story. So they've moved to the city. Of course, their income levels have increased as opposed to how much they were earning in their villages or in their native places. The women definitely feel more empowered. They have capitalized on social networks, and there's a community spirit. They're coming from different districts, so there is a positive story. But again, what is that? I mean, as a city, first of all, has Bangalore actually have we used or utilized or overutilized its absorptive capacity? There is no space to accommodate these people, which is why they are moving to unviable, unsafe landfills and sites near construction, because it demands them to it. There's no place to accommodate them. So given all these situations, do you actually promote migration, or do you actually look at strategies which lead back to the rural areas where you think of improving the conditions back home? Because a lot of them, as thank you, Pratigna, for asking the aspiration questions as well, because yes, they do, some of them do feel that, or most of them actually feel that they would like to go back if the conditions improve. And the migrants coming from West Bengal say that this is a foreign land. They don't feel that they are part of the city. They don't feel welcome. So yeah, that's about it. Karthik, would you like to respond to some?
Pardon. You asked me about the different stages of recognition, so even I completely agree to that. The recognition occurs not just in one stage. There are various stages which keep going one after another. And the important thing, what we have noticed in our field research, is that the recognition happens if there is a collective action, if the people come together and put pressure on the local MLA. That is very important. There are some settlements which aren't recognized yet, but they have access to electricity. A settlement near Matikere is an example of that. But there are some settlements which are already in the recognized list, but they do not have proper access. And this all comes down to how much pressure the population in that settlement can put in on the local governing bodies. And that is why the language connect, the formation of a collective, is so much important in these cases. Like, at least that's what we observed. Coming to what Pratigna asked, in these older settlements, if you ask them if they are a migrant, they usually say no. They say that they have been born in the city, which is true. And they are migrants in the sense that their fathers or their forefathers would have been migrants into the city. back then, long distance migrations weren't that common. So you could see migrations from like Tamil Nadu, Andhra, and even North Karnataka coming into the city. But you wouldn't find like people from Bihar, West Bengal, who have been living here for 40 years, and in informal settlements especially. Coming to the question on the paper about Kundu, so we did go through that, and we knew that this was counterintuitive what we have found here. And one important difference what we felt was like in that paper, the focus wasn't really on just informal settlements. That was more of migrations of all classes of the society, and that does make sense. Like for an upper class, you would move for education, and with better education, you would get a better job, and then as such, a migrant will fare better if you compare to a non-migrant as such. But if you look at just the economically marginalized people, which is what we have done, which is we have taken into account only the socially and the economically marginalized. And that is why I think we have found this result where migrants are more vulnerable than non-migrants. They earn lesser, they are more vulnerable in terms of their services, access to services, etc.
Also, another observation was that migrants coming from West Bengal, or the interstate migrants, they found it really hard to get hold of the ID cards, especially the waste pickers, to collect waste. So, as opposed to the intra-state, the migrants coming from Karnataka, different districts of or villages of Karnataka, found it much easier to get those ID cards. So again, there is that dynamics between the inter versus the intrastate migrants, and I totally agree with your suggestion that we would like to go back, and this is an ongoing research, so we will be going back and we will try and demystify what's happening, because there's so much to learn, and you can't just attribute it to one factor. So yes, definitely, and we are going to be looking at how effective these coping measures are in the long run. Are they actually becoming maladaptive in the long run? So trying to figure out this. Thank you.
Okay, let's.
I mean, I think you started with saying your project was to demystify how effective is migration as a coping strategy. Right? Coping strategy in the context of adaptation strategy, or is in the context of climate change related distress. Right? Now, when I think in those terms, I think two kinds of questions which come in. Like, I mean, Bangalore city, maybe, for all easy purpose, take 8 million people, 5% growth, which is something like 400,000 people increasing. So I think one of the key points I'm trying to make there is that numbers are important here, right? How many of that 400,000 are actually born here and migrants, and how many of that is in fact the kind of population that you are studying? That's the first thing, very important. Now, why is it important? Well, it's important because of a lot of tropes that we work with, like informal settlements. A large amount of housing in this city is informal. Not just slums, and large amount of slums are formal in the sense that they are regularized. So how do you choose who to study is quite important, in the sense it's not poor people, it's a wide spectrum of economic class migrates here, right? And so if we are thinking about the question, how do we answer whether migration creates vulnerability or not, the real fact that the people who have come from elsewhere is continuing to live here is a simple truism that they are better off than where they have come from. But then the question is, what do we really get out of the study, and what are we really looking for? Becomes very, very significant. Now, in that context, the gradation is important in the sense, and the specific population is important, and comparative study of non-migrants is important. And in that context, I would like to reflect on the point that you were raising earlier, that the people who have born here are also migrants. I think it's quite important to reflect as a scholar whether do we fall into the trap of social construction of the other, right? I mean, when does a migrant eventually stop being a migrant? Before birth? What do you have to do to be not a migrant? In the sense that when you have sample population, it's quite important that question that you were asking on the age is important, and that's what I was right. Second reflection I have is on stepping back. I think it's a huge opportunity to step back and see climate related, right? That's one. Okay, of course, disaster happened, this happened, many kinds of things happen under control, something can be controlled, something are unexpected, and so it creates displacements of many sorts and people move into different places. So big events, right? Now, but there are economic policy which in fact results into certain kind of urbanization in the country. How do we distribute urbanization? How do we invest on infrastructure? How do we invest in jobs? Where do we invest in jobs? What is our idea on bringing in cheap labor? What is our idea on labor competition? What's our idea on all of that? And then in that context, how does this migration distinct from the climate change distress related ones? And I think that we will have to go back to the early question that we were raising. How do you make sure that certain migrations are specifically climate change related?
Good afternoon, everyone, and I hope that I can, since I'm not an urban studies scholar and I'm actually working in rural India, so I hope I can convince you all that we need to shift our focus to the village. So let's see how that goes. So my paper is titled Circular Migration and Localized Urbanization in Rural India. So basically, I'm going to start by making a case for studying the source of circular migration, which is the village. I'm going to describe the village a little bit, Mahagaon village in Gulbarga or Kalaburgi district. Then go on to the environmental constraints, as some of which have already come up in the previous presentation. Then talk about the circular migration in Mahagaon. What do migrants bring back to the village once they are, because I never went to the city, I was in the village all along. And what happens in terms of transport and infrastructure as a result of migration. And then finally to localized urbanization in Mahagaon. And then I'll talk a little bit about what is the implication of all this for the nature of dispersed urbanization in India today and the growth of census towns. So I'm still going to be in the village all throughout, but maybe at the end make some speculations about towns. So we all know that internal migration drives urbanization. People have written about this. The classical theories of labor migration, as Sridevi also mentioned, typically they focus on migration from rural to the urban, from national to international settings, and from, we generally understand it as there's a move from tradition to a traditional area to a modern area. Migration in this framework is typically looked at as a one-time, one-way, and permanent settlement, as one of the chairs also mentioned, is seen as the goal of all migration. Once you look at it this way, and urbanization typically is happening at the destination of the migration, and then circular migration or return migration or seasonal migration become failed migrations. But typically, the people who theorize circular migration, they tend to address this two-way nature of migration. They don't look at it as failed migration. But even when they do so, they tend to focus typically on these three aspects of it, one of which is they look at the migrant in the process of migration or migrant at the destination of migration. What kind of amenities are there in the city? What are the housing? What are the conditions? What are the wages, etc. If at all migrants are studied at the source of migration, it is usually in the context of production relations. Like basically what I mean by this is, how does migration mitigate the relationship between, say, a landless laborer and a landlord once the migrant is back in the village? So typically this is the way in which circular migration studies tend to look at migration. So what I'm arguing in this paper is that the nature of change in the village, particularly spatial change, is a relatively unexplored area. And this is particularly important in the case of short-term circular migration, which is over a long period of time. So you have several cycles of circular migration over, say, a decade or 2 decades. What does it do to the village? And then later I'll talk about the dispersed nature of urbanization. So my field site is actually, for this paper, is a village in northeastern Karnataka, which is Hyderabad, Karnataka, in Gulbarga district, Mahagaon village. So my study is based on actually a village survey monograph produced by the Census of India in 1961, and my own fieldwork in 2014, where I conducted household surveys, a sample of one-fourth of the households according to Census 2011, as well as interviews with, semi-structured interviews with informants, such as people who gained land reforms, etc., and Gram Panchayat members, and so on and so forth. So Mahagaon village. Now Mahagaon itself is a very interesting name. It's a large village by its name. It's a dryland village in Gulbarga district. It's a large village in 2011 with a population of 8,731, which technically would classify as a town only if it met the occupational criteria and perhaps the density criteria as well. This region, the northeastern part of Karnataka, is in all studies termed backward. It has low literacy rates, it has a worsening sex ratio, a low poverty head count, there are people going hungry there, it's an area of low productivity. And in fact, this is also historical. The harsh environment contributed to famines in the late 1800s, which had two main impacts in this region, which are important for me in my study. It led to an increase in landlessness because of money lenders foreclosing loans and taking over the land of the landed farmers. And there was a rise in dominant class tenancy, which is also known as reverse tenancy in the literature, where basically the tenant is actually is actually the richer party in the transaction, where typically we understand landlord being the larger party and tenant as the poorer one. Reverse tenancy or dominant class tenancy is where the tenant is the richer party in the transaction. So these two were features of the land relations, as one may say. So this becomes important for me because landlessness today remains still a feature of Mahagaon's agriculture. It is from 46% households in 1961 being landless. Today it's 47% being landless. And the average land holdings have dropped considerably, and this is happening all over the country. From in Mahagaon, from 12.5 acres per household in 1961 to nearly 3 acres per household in 2014. And several people, this is from secondary data, so several people have also written about how there's a productivity crisis in the region in all crops, including cereal crops and coarse cereal crops, as well as this is for tuar dal, which is the Gulbarga district is the tuar bowl of Karnataka. It produces nearly 56% of all the tuar of Karnataka. But even for even for this crop, the yield has been from 1998 to 2009 has been below the national average of the country, and so the yields are, I mean, it is the tuar bowl because of the amount of area that is under tuar production, not because the land is productive. So what does this do to the people in the village when you have 46% or 47% of households landless in the village? What does this do? The Dalits, Lambanis and the Muslim households in the village, who are predominantly landless, they are left with two main options, one of which is to become what the literature uses the term debt bondage. So you basically get bonded to a landlord. Today we don't typically talk of it as bonded labor because bonded labor is also banned, and these are not necessarily long-term arrangements. The laborer can break the arrangement in another year and go somewhere else or work for another landlord. But typically the first arrangement is that of having a year-long arrangement with a landlord, and you take an advance payment in 2 installments. Okay. Yeah. So that is one of the arrangements that you can have for a landless laborer. And the second is to be an agricultural wage laborer and only work during harvesting season, and work as other wage labor in, as contract laborers in various other kinds of contracts. And this is what a large proportion of landless laborers in Mahagaon do. They are circular migrants, primarily working in construction work in the cities of Bombay, Pune and Bangalore. And this is what the previous paper also showed us. Nearly 9% of workers in Mahagaon in 2013, they spent about 1 to 10 months of their time in a city. And what are the strategies of circular migrants? This again is similar to what the previous papers and several other work has already shown. They tend to minimize their expenditure in the city. So even they would take their PDS grain from the village and go to the city to minimize their expenditure in the city. They leave behind children and their parents back in the village. Children go to the government school in the village. And they also deal with the low standard of life in the city. Now this, since I haven't really done work on this, this is more from other work as well as what people told me. But what do they do when they come back? What do migrants bring back? So apart from the fact that they bring back savings into the village, they're also bringing back skills in construction. Several Dalit, Muslim and Lambani, who are scheduled tribes for Karnataka, and they're also scheduled castes in Andhra Pradesh. They bring back skills in construction. They know how to do the centering work of the ceiling, and they in fact build their own home. So this is inside the home of a Dalit migrant who had built, it's a one-room house, which was built by the male member. At the time of this survey, both the male and the female member of the household were migrating. They were in the city. And I met the parent and the child in the house. They also tend to bring back cultural icons. For instance, here you see a photo of Ambedkar, which was brought back from Chaitya Bhumi in Dadar. So they come back with these memorabilia. And this, and Gidwani and Shivramakrishnan have written about this. Circular migration is, they see long-term circular migration is also a strategy to basically assert yourself back when you come from different identities, and especially for Dalits. And this is something that I saw again in different realms of life in terms of entry to a temple in the village as well as conducting marriages. They were not allowed to do so in 1961, but they do it today. So there are aspects where there is some resistance. This is also supported by transport and road infrastructure coming up. Now, if you can see here, the growth rate of roads in Gulbarga is actually higher than that of the state as a whole. And the Mahagaon-Humnabad road was declared a national highway in 2006. And basically so the circular migrants are bringing back skills and they can construct houses, but there needs to be capital. So who invests capital? There are typically other landowners who also find agriculture not so remunerative. They start investing in various kinds of transport. There are cruisers, autos and petrol bunks on a settlement which I'm just going to talk about. And basically I used for all my fieldwork, I wasn't using government buses, I was using these private transport, which are shared transport, which you see in Calcutta or anywhere else, similar kinds of transport. And this is again to show that basically, while in 1961, 26% of the total debt was to conduct marriages. In 2014, the largest amount of debt was for business. So again, people are really investing in various kinds of businesses. What does this lead to? And here, this is a photo of the Mahagaon cross, which is at the junction of the Mahagaon-Humnabad National Highway and the Mahagaon-Chincholi State Highway. There's an entire settlement here which has come up. So I'm calling this localized urbanization. This is a phenomenon of spontaneous growth of a new hamlet with an urban character in a rural context. And this is prompted by the metropolis, but it occurs locally and it can happen as in this case, at a considerable distance from the metropolis. So this is a map which I've made just to show the different hamlets of Mahagaon Revenue Village. These 4 hamlets, Mahagaon Wadi, Mahagaon Chandarnagar and the Tanda, were there in 1961. But today you have a large settlement on the highway. And Mahagaon Cross is the spontaneous part of it. The Dhamur is actually a resettlement colony, but again, the choice of the resettlement colony also happens along the highway. So Yeah, and the first settlement actually came up on Mahagaon Cross when the government decided to give plots of land to people who were willing to get sterilized in the late 1970s. And there are two colonies actually on Mahagaon Cross, which are predominantly Dalit and Muslim households who got sterilized and got the plot of land. And today, 1/4 of the households in Mahagaon Revenue Village, in this entire thing, is in Mahagaon Cross on the highway. And this is just a table to show what kind of amenities exist. So people on Mahagaon Cross don't have all that much in terms of assets. So I've calculated assets, I collected data on a list of assets, and then I've used an indicator to kind of compare them based on what their market prices are. So you actually have the elite of the village still within Mahagaon, within the main village as well as in other hamlets of the village. But what you see in Mahagaon Cross is that the built up area is much higher. People using LPG for cooking is much higher than the rest of the village. Pit latrines, now this is a village with very high open defecation. So here you have on the cross much higher use of pit latrines. And you also have a rental market for housing, which doesn't really exist in a lot of villages. So, So now I come to the part where, I need to now think about what does this mean, because there's a literature on subaltern urbanization, which is talking about autonomous, economically vital and settlements which are independent of the metropolis. So what I'm saying here is that localized urbanization, because the way subaltern urbanization is classified, it includes everything other than metropolitan urbanization. So Mahagaon would fit into something like that. So it is a subset of subaltern urbanization in that sense, but it is dependent on the metropolis because it's part of the circular migration story. And another thing that I wanted to raise here is that even while the subaltern urbanization literature discusses migration, they typically tend to focus on the destination of migration, which tend to be towns or small towns. Whereas here I'm shifting the focus, I'm trying to shift the focus to the source of the migration. So Mahagaon is still a village, but actually the administrative status is contested because they are trying to fight for a taluk status, and maybe sometime down the line it will become a town. So yeah, with that I just wanted to end by saying that while the urbanization is slow in India and we are expecting half of India's population to be in cities by 2050, we are seeing also that a large part of this growth is happening outside metropolitan centers, and 30% of the urban growth in the last decade, 2001 to 2011, happened in what is known as census towns. So maybe understanding what's happening in Mahagaon and the kind of crosses, and Mahagaon cross is not the only cross that is coming up. The village I stayed in also has a cross along the highway, and it seems that other districts such as Bijapur also have similar settlements along major roads. So maybe understanding all this will give us some some insight into this kind of urbanization. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions?
Hi, Saundarya. First of all, just to clarify one bit, how far is Mahagaon from the nearest city? Far, right?
It's like 45 minutes from Urban city.
Right, because it's interesting because when you talk of subaltern urbanization, I really do not understand on what basis does the Mahagaon cross have an urban character. But when I was listening to your presentation, I could get a brief idea in terms of what it sort of coincided with my idea of peripheral urbanization, like the peri-urban fringe. So for example, first is the resettlement colony. So in many places, the resettlement colony, the peripheries in India are associated with the marginalization, and a lot of resettlement are in the peripheries. The other is the tenant system that you talked about, the 70,000, the bonded laborer system. And I found that when I was doing my research, I found that that is a system that often comes up with an absentee landlord structure, where you know, the landlord is probably some urban guy who has invested in rural lands for speculative purposes, and he just gives it on a one-off payment to the you know, employer cum tenant. So in that sense, I find that the tenancy structure changes as one moves from periphery to a bit more rural. So you may want to reflect on that. And also, like, largely across the panel also, I think one of my suggestions would be to also look at this special dimension of migration, which is, you know, the peri-urban fringe, because these are agrarian villages, but they are being subjected to urbanization very quickly. And so the migrants who work there are simultaneously industrial and agricultural. So they're rural migrants, they come from a specific village, but they take time in they access both the industrial economy of the city and the agriculture economy of the village just nearby. So they're both you know, settled and commuters. So yeah, anyways.
This figures for debt that you showed, the two columns, how do you collect this? And secondly, what is this census town?
Yes. Thank you. That was a very interesting presentation. I did want to confirm, I think you said that the population of this village was 8731, and so, I mean, I would imagine that counts as a census town, so I'm a little confused about that. Maybe I missed something there. And secondly, I think I would sort of argue with your characterization of the literature as mostly having studies focusing on migration at the destination. I think it's in fact, even if you look at Deshinkar and Farrington's volume, like the majority of the studies are based on the villages, the source villages, right? And in fact, I'm very interested to see some of the studies that you're citing, but still I think to characterize the literature as focusing largely on destination areas would certainly be very contestable.
I think this again is a very, very pertinent topic for research, especially in contemporary India when we are talking about law. I have a very specific question. You said that the circular migrants, when they go back to village, you use the word that they become more assertive. I think that's a very important thing because they can assert. But what I'm also going to ask you is, because of this assertion, does it lead to conflict with the landlords? Does it change the configuration of the institutions like panchayat? And does it enhance the bargaining power of this group of migrants vis-a-vis the landlords? And are there instances of land buying by these migrants who go back to the village? That is one question. The other thing is, looks like in India, what is happening is in rural areas, the non-farm activities are increasing. You see, the census shows, the economic census shows. And it is very interesting that you saw the highway and the number of trucks and other things are increasing. Has there been any increase in the non-farm activity because of this? Anyway, because the money is going more, maybe people are getting into some activities and all. And how does it relate to this thing, in terms of that whole development of that particular village?
I think you can answer these, then Jairaj has some questions.
Okay, so I wouldn't classify this as peri-urban to begin with, because while it's 20 kilometers from Gulbarga, migrants are going, as well as Gulbarga, they also go to very much further away to cities of Bombay, Pune, and even villages closer to Gulbarga do not show this phenomenon of a cross coming up. It is only the large villages which show this kind of agglomeration along the highway. Secondly, So there is absentee landlordism in this village, and because my survey was conducted in the village, you don't get data on absentee landlords who are not living in the village. So but you do. I mean, I did hear about the fact that there are people who live in Gulbarga. They have lands in the village, and they're typically from the dominant castes who may be classified as OBCs, but they are dominant castes within the village, and they are actually investing in transport. They'll have 1 to 10 such cruisers running every day from all the way from Gulbarga to Humnabad and back. And they hire drivers, conductors, etc. for all these things. Yeah, the debt figures, I basically, the 1961 village survey monograph that I used has the data for 1961, and I collected data on credit by source and the amount of credit in my own survey. It was a sample survey, not a census, but it was a robust sample of 1/4 of all households in the village. So that's how I'm making the comparison. And about the village, Mahagaon has 8,731 households, but it still has 49% of the male working force in agriculture. And to be classified as a census town, the definition is that you should have a minimum population of 5,000, at least 75% of the male main workers engaged in non-agricultural pursuits, and a density of at least 400 per square kilometer. So it doesn't really fit yet into this. It may fit in maybe a couple of years. And yes, Deshankar and Farrington, they do look at source villages, but my argument here in this paper is that they tend to study migrants and migrants in the process of migration, rather than migrants as a part of the local economy and what it does to spatially to the village. So that's where I say that my study is doing something different. In terms of how do people come back and assert themselves and what does it do to relationships, I have only a few instances because I did not delve in depth into this aspect of it. One of which was that there is this very famous temple, Lingayat temple in the village, which is the Akka Mahadevi temple, which used to be controlled by Lingayats in 1961. They were part of the committee, organizing committee and such things. And Dalits were not allowed entry into this temple in 1961. Today they not only have entry, there is a marriage hall in the temple where they conduct their weddings as well. But in terms of what it does to relationships, I mean, the very fact that the phenomenon of Kuliyal, what I called, exists, and people don't have any other option other than, because they're landless, they don't have any other option other than either migrate or work by taking advance payments from the landlord, indicates that there is still there is a high level of, some level of servitude at least in the village. Land sales, I did not get into land sales, so I don't know. Land sales is also a very difficult aspect of study, and I have not really collected data on land sales. Non-farm activity in the villages, there are many, people do a lot of, several households have members who are self-employed, and the self-employment can range from, being a bangle seller by, people buying bangles from Gulbarga and selling it in different villages of, or in and around Mahagaon, to actually having a hotel on the cross. So there's a large range of activities people do, but like I said, 49% of male main workers are still in agriculture. So according to census classifications, I think it's still a very highly agricultural workforce.
Just have some reflection on this. It's a provocation. You started with saying, okay, let's study rural, and yet you concluded with theorizing a category called, what did you call it? Not subaltern, but localized urbanization. Why does this become significant in reflecting things? I mean, this is the reason why it occurred to me in this manner is that, scholarship works with categories. Certain categories more than others, and sometimes we miss the opportunity to in fact reflect on it and maybe understand how processes work. So for instance, urbanization studies, it's clear that village is part of it, or like we work with urban, city, village, peri-urban, these are taken as existing categories, and I'm just reflecting on an experience I had a few weeks ago in Madurai. We went to study handloom textile industry, okay, handloom industry. And there's this person who has 100 handloom tari, we call it. I don't know what you call it in English. And we were talking to the workers there, and I realized, in fact, they come from, a few of them come from a place 5 kilometers from my village. And 2 places, another 1 kilometer from my village, in Kerala, in Chittoor. And then we were talking and realized about 4 decades, 5 decades, 3 generations they've been coming. So then I realized I can't study Kodumba or Devankapuram, the 2 places in my village, without studying Selur. I can't understand handloom in Selur without understanding Kodumba and Devankapuram. And you can't, of course, understand the transformation of textile in Madurai if you don't understand Tirupur. So here you took a method of circular migration studies in the sense that, how 2 places become linked, which was a great opportunity to think about, and I would reflect that way to see how the scholarship, how the bounded geographies we use in scholarships. In fact, the topics that we study makes us really rework it. In fact, it is not. It's of flows. It's of transitions. It's of connections between places. Not necessarily. So the compulsion to define local urbanization as a category is probably less important. More than to think about how these 2 places make each other, how people in these 2 places make each other. In that sense, the geography of your work is not necessarily a bounded category, but it's actually space of flows, right? Corridors. So I thought I would reflect it also in the context of city in transition. But
you want to respond? Any other question? We still have like 7 minutes to fill. So I think we should have some reflection in general.
I also would want to take a step back and then look at migration as such, which is happening in this currently globalized world. Like migration is not just happening in India, migration is happening all over the world. Like people are moving from different countries, and associated with this migration, like though this globalization is leading to some positive economic growth, also it's leading to this form of otherization which is happening, especially if you see like a migrant coming into your place and see him or her earning more than you are. There's this huge otherization which takes place, like you have this form of xenophobia, like you start hating or fearing the other. And with this, like I guess, like personally I feel that it's leading to this all these right-wing movements, like Brexit, for example. So what I would hope for some answers at least is that what do we do to avoid this otherization, because it seems very counterproductive to globalization, but globalization and otherization seem to be happening hand in hand. So if anyone has some thoughts, maybe.
Question to the entire panel and anyone else. Cities are seen as engines of growth, and migration is what makes them what they are now in India. Is migration a necessary constituent of this engine of growth, or can it be independently an engine of growth? Because all of India's cities are going to break down in another few years. Like Bangalore's breaking, all of them are on the way to breaking down. So is it something that can be avoided if you have a different model of development? Because every state, the moment a state is hived off from a previous larger state, you find that capital developing beyond disproportionately. So the moral of the story is you have to have a capital-centric developmental model for every state, and you'll, in due course, it'll become a black hole like Calcutta. So is this an inevitable thing? Is there a way you can steer it off this model of development? What are the other options? Because life, the quality of life is going to become terrible in all these cities in a few years.
Can I respond to that?
One thing I'd like to add is the same thing. One thing is that, first of all, we have to analyze, is it a positive thing, is it a negative thing? So is migration the problem, or the way we deal with it is a problem? So if the problem is the way we deal with it, then there can be solutions. But I think it would be wrong to say that migration itself is a problem and not accepting the fact that we're not capable enough to deal with it. And although we know the fact that it is inevitable. One thing is that, second thing is that I would want to know, is there a successful case study on the way it has been dealt in a very positive way? Just curious that if anybody knows, they can share.
Karen is here. I don't think she's around. Karen Levy. Karen Levy works in DPU, where Nigel Harris used to work, who actually supposed to have used first cities as engines of economic growth. And I was in conferences where Nigel has said that I regret using it, because the way it has gotten around and used by to a level where our students were in Kochi last week, where they saw 4,500 crore Vallarbadam container terminal, transshipment terminal, completely useless. LNG terminal, 2,500 crores, no industry want the gas, but the building is built. Metro, 6,000 crore, metro people themselves saying we wish we didn't build it. So cities as engines of economic growth as a discourse probably has done a large impact onto the nature of thinking about how do we do urbanization in the country, how do we distribute capital, how do we distribute labor, what are the policies about it, and so on, which eventually also resulted into, if you listen to Chidambaram's talk during the World Economic Forum a few years ago, which he gave an interview to one of the American TVs, very clearly says that he would like people from rural areas to come and work in the urban areas, you know. The certain kind of capital-labor relation and geographies of that, you can see in many ways, in my opinion at least, is probably people who have had their own autonomies of many kind, you know, peasant class and others, becoming a permanent underclass elsewhere and building all over again. And from that perspective, of course, it is a hugely problematic turn to that particular discourse. I mean, you don't have to go anywhere, just read 2005 Mumbai Vision Plan by, what is a group, McKinsey, to understand that ambition. Earlier, Som was saying in the first meeting that, you know, people on this side of the table and that side of the table belong to the same cultural collective which understands and agrees that the 6,000 crore investment has to go, and it goes. Without really looking at the repercussions. In that sense, I think it's something very critically to be thought about. But on the flip side of it, there are cities supposed to be global cities, right, which cannot function without migration, which seems to be actually developing their economic, social, cultural capital experience, you know, all of that based on people coming in and going. So there are two sides to the same thing. I think it's not probably less to do with migration, and migration is not necessarily anything that tells us anything, but what type, what kind, what time, why, the specific questions that probably might be useful to ask.
Would you like to respond? Anyone would like to respond? Maybe Shravan. I think, you see, the migration as an issue, you know, even if you look at the statistics, you know, in fact, in the overall urban growth, the share of migration is not important. Now it is the in-situ growth of population which is contributing more to India's urban growth.
So that migration leading to, there's a whole debate about rural poverty shifting to urban poverty because of migration. I think that is one thing. So the statistics also doesn't prove, though there is a volume of migration. The other thing is, if you look into the history of any civilization with modernization and all, mobility tends to increase. Higher the level of development, higher is the mobility. But the only problem is mobility tends to become not unidirectional, but it is much more, from rural to urban, urban to rural to small town and medium town. India's problem of migration to cities is because our urbanization is, the structure of urbanization is so imbalanced. Therefore, the small and medium towns, even in our policy plans, and we don't recommend it for the growth, so that they don't, absorb many of the surplus population getting into urban area. So I think that is one of the thing. The other thing is, if you see migrants only as an economic entity, then that also creates a fallacy, in terms, because migration is also about flow of ideas, and especially in a multicultural society like India, I think it is also a process of integration. Now, whether you agree or not, that's a different argument, but it is a fact that more people interface and connect to each other through mobility and, living together. I think that also helps in the whole urbanization debate. So urban, if you see it from only as an economic thing, then maybe sometimes it tend to look bad. But if you see urban as more as a cultural, as a more progressive thing, I think then migration certainly is important. And for me, I think migration is going to continue. Like, say for instance, on the only country in the world history so far, maybe after the Romans, the Chinese. The Chinese had a hukou policy which controlled migration. But the recent thing, they have also failed. Like, if you go to Beijing, if you go to Shanghai, if you go to any big city, officially they don't allow migration. But go to the periphery of the cities, there are all illegal migrants. And now they have realized that it is impossible, so they are relaxing the hukou policy. So I think controlling migration is not a right solution for, what needs is more of a, I think we need to have a more spatial, regional spatial strategies that may be useful.
Okay. So I think we are almost nearing the finish line. Okay.
Yeah.
I've attended 2 or 3 talks in Delhi. Delhi is swamped by the eastern migration, mostly the economic. And for a scholar to find this out is through statistics. But if you're just going through Delhi and you meet up with auto drivers and a lot of people, most of them are migrants. Is it the case that they're in situ, or you said it's not actually the migration from outside. The population increase is from inside.
What I'm saying is, there is migration, but the contribution which urbanization which used to take place because of migration has gone down. Now, if you analyze the growth of the cities, it is more because of in-situ population growth, the fertility increase in the cities, rather than the migration. Migration is still happening, but the share of contribution from the higher fertility rate in urban areas is more contributing than the migration. So migration is not stopping, migration is taking place.
So the fertility of women in urban areas is more than the fertility of women in
not women as such, overall fertility in urban areas, is more, and that is contributing to urban growth rather than the migration rate, which was higher in, say, 60s and 70s. So if you read the Kingsley Davis's famous work on India, that's what he says about, rural to urban. But I think that trend is changing.
Thank you. So I'll request Jairaj to give his final thoughts, then I'll also give mine, and we conclude.
after this, the enduring questions came up, definitely, right? The question of why do we study migration and what migration studies bring to us? Does it bring anything specific, if not from a specific perspective? And the question of whether migrants are problematic, who is a migrant, who do you study at what point, certain specific times, there are certain specific groups come and say, all of that is, do these exceptionalize anything? It's a very significant question, and most of the times they don't, unless very specific questions that we are asking, like how does the, how does the union accept the migrants in Kerala, and why doesn't they accept it? And why are they not part of Marxist theory? Are they not part of class theory? Are they not part of the relationship? So, that kind of question. Then there is obviously, David Harvey's very significant provocation of accumulation by dispossession, that people have been dispossessed from large parts of the world for accumulation of capital by certain group. And it's a very important provocation to think about, even if you're not a Marxist, right? I mean, looking at things that is going on, disasters that are uncontrollable is one thing, partition like another, but there are continuous produced disasters of many kinds. So that is a very significant provocation to think of, making people dispossessed from places and making them permanent underclass elsewhere. And all across, it is not necessarily poor. In Indian context, we are right now only talking about poor people, because that's not the case. There's a wide spectrum of economic classes that one has to understand, think about. Second question I want to reflect is on the issue of who is a migrant. Even after third generation, people end up being migrant, and scholarship has to be very careful about thinking about it, without taking it very reflectively. Third is methodological challenges. There are very significant methodological challenges that we have seen in three of the presentations too, and other conversations too, on why do we study migration and the method that we adopt. Because otherwise we may not answer the question that we really would like to answer. That's mainly, other than all that which I have been speaking of.
Thank you, Jairaj.
Oh, one more point.
Okay.
Sorry, and this I missed. In fact, I study planning practices, and the least of the capable practices that is organized to address flows of people. Planning is totally clueless, especially the kind of planning we work in this country, comprehensive development plan, which is an outdated instrument. Not most of the world uses it. We still use it, fixes things for 10 years. And idea of controlling density, controlling land uses, controlling infrastructure allocations, and so on. And what we saw is a very dynamic city in the last three presentations and all the conversation. People come in and out and go, and they need services, and then access rights. What are their rights? Planning is very, very incapable of addressing it as we practice it. And it's a big challenge for planning anywhere.
Thank you, Jairaj. Well, to conclude, I have nothing much to say, but just a few points. I think this is something related to my work. I feel when we are talking about migration, we are actually skipping or avoiding the root cause of this problem. And in my understanding or the way I look at things, I think the agricultural crisis in the country is something which has to be deeply studied, and what has led to this situation. And one of the things that we were talking about in an earlier workshop in Delhi last week was, is there a system that we could think through where land aggregation, agricultural land aggregation happens? And can we think about an institutional mechanism that legitimizes this through legislation, so that the land holdings become productive, at least in the economic sense? So that is one aspect that I focus on in my work. The second aspect is that the whole broad idea about the experience of a migrant. Quality of life in cities is not good, he's not able to save much, and therefore it's just everyday struggle. How can we sort of lighten this? So one of the interesting things that researchers are trying to address is to look at commuting as a mitigating measure. Can we sort of improve connectivity and let the migrant come, work, and then go back to his home in the evening? So that is an interesting area of work that is emerging, and some of the justification in the realm of the National Highways Project, the State Highways Project, etc., is in that domain. But it's too early to say because these are intergenerational outcomes, and policies have some inbuilt inertia. There are political ramifications, political contestations, and we'll have to observe and see how much of it is productively transformed. The third aspect is, which Shravan also alluded to, is this whole sad outcome of the last 60-65 years of very unbalanced regional development. So what we are seeing in the country is like certain regions developing competitive capacities, and then the governmental attention that let's enhance their capacities further and make them as cities that sort of drives economic growth. So most of the attention has been on these centers and not been on centers which are lacking and why they are lacking. So we haven't, and partly that's an outcome of an improper unit of analysis. So we have never, and it's only very recently that the scholarship has tried to understand regional dimensions of development, although in geography, etc., people attempted to examine it. Also later years from the discipline of economics, but in a very contiguous kind of an imagination. What does regional development mean, and how can it balance poor outcomes? So those are my broad three sort of inputs. In the context of the papers that were presented, and also in the broader context of migration as a thematic area or issue, I feel that there's a lot of work that still needs to be done from multiple angles. There's a category of the process of migration, so, which means that when does it start, and the category of looking at how does it remain relevant in either discrete or continuous kind of an imagination, and why is it relevant? Questions are at the back asked. So that is looking at the process of migration. But the most important question, in my opinion, is that what is the two-way experience of migration? So at multiple levels. If we look at individuals, if we look at households, and how institutions have evolved. Have we been able to develop an institutional framework that is responsive enough or capable enough to handle these kinds of challenges? And migration is essentially a livelihoods challenge. And how this two-way interaction of the process of migration and then the experience of migration are shaping each other. The third category, which I feel is, and this is what many people ask, is that, okay, let's now look at the subjective, let's now put a subjective and an objective lens to it, which Shravan very lightly pointed out, that, okay, what's this process doing to them? Socially, psychologically, materially, are they able to buy land or not? Are they moving up the ladder in terms of economic prosperity, etc.? So what is doing to them, subjectively and objectively? And is this transition redefining or reshaping social relations, the manner in which we are using resources, the manner in which production activities are organized? Can we say something about this? We can say it theoretically, we can say it through practice-based engagements. We can also look at it from a policy perspective and do some kind of evaluation. I feel most of the presentations fell broadly within this framework, but personally I feel that migration as a thematic issue requires a lot more scholarship, particularly from a bottom-up perspective, a nuanced perspective. And the challenge which I feel lies in methodology. I think what I feel is that only one particular or a couple of disciplinary methodologies will not be able to do justice to this very important issue. And we'll have to draw from multiple and other disciplines and try and understand this issue very systematically. This is going to be very relevant in the next 20, 30, 40 years, at least in the Indian context, and therefore an important question always to answer. So with these thoughts, I'd like to conclude this session, and with a round of applause, thank you to all the presenters, and also to Jairaj for agreeing to sit with me here. I requested him at the last moment, and he was very kind enough to oblige me, as he always does. And I hope this was useful to the presenters as well as to the people who are present here. And I don't think there's any other agenda today, so we'll be meeting at dinner.
Alright guys, just a few things. Like Amir mentioned, we will be meeting at dinner. So in regard to that, do let me know how many of us need transport from here to Tarangmana, which is our guest house, so that we can arrange for it. Can we just do a quick show of hands? Okay. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that we have an ongoing exhibition right now. We'll have more of a sustained engagement with the artists exhibiting from tomorrow onwards. They'll be they will be present for all of the panels. There is a dedicated panel later in the evening tomorrow, starting at 6:30, where we will have the artists engage with the audience, talking about their work.